Hey everyone, so in today's video we're gonna take a look at bows in Elden Rings and how to make the most out of them. We'll go over everything, so the bows, the arrows, the talisman, the best way to play it, the consumables, everything. And just so you know, this is mostly gonna be for endgame or for new game plus. And I'll just start by saying that with the right setup, bow can do a very decent amount of damage, even in new game plus. I'm also planning on making a progression guide for the bow in new game, so from the beginning to the end. But that's gonna be another video. This one is mostly on end game builds. But first things first, not all bows are created equal, and some of them are clearly a lot better than others. So for end game bow builds, the main bow that I recommend, without any surprise, is the black bow. And the black bow is very special because it's considered a long bow, so it has the range and the damage of a long bow, but it has the move set of a short bow. So you have the barrage skill, which is probably the best skill for bows. But also, and it's very important, with the black bow, you're able to shoot while jumping, but also you can shoot while landing and after a roll, which you are unable to do with a regular long bow. So the black bow is going to be your main bow, but I do suggest having a secondary bow, either a great bow or a long bow with mighty shot. Those are especially good for mobbing because you can do a ton of damage with one arrow, especially if you take the time to land a headshot. So for mobbing, you can kill enemies from a long distance with just one arrow. So my recommendation is to use the Radan bow, because not only is it good for mobbing, you can do a ton of damage with one arrow, but also for large enemies like the dragons, the weapon art on this weapon is insane. It does a ton of damage to large enemies. But of course, the other very important part of the bow is the arrows you're going to be using. So we're going to quickly take a look at which arrows are good and which arrows are best to avoid. So to me, there are two S tier arrows in this game. The first one is the blood arrows, and I don't think I have to spend too much time explaining why they are good. Blood in this game is an insane status, probably the best status in the game. So having arrows that inflict blood is really good. And the other S tier arrows are the Stormwing arrows, and those are often overlooked. So the reason they're so good is because, first of all, they are the highest physical damage arrows in the game. So if you're looking for the arrows that does the most damage, Stormwing, out of any arrows on any monster in the game, will be the best arrows for damage. And on top of that, as an added bonus, it does posture damage. So if you use those arrows on a boss, you'll often get at least one, if not two, posture break, which is a really nice added benefit. But of course, the blood arrows are really easy to get because you can just buy the roses from the merchant. But the Stormhawk arrows, the drawback is that they're very hard to come by. You cannot buy them anywhere. You have to farm those birds in the Stormveil castle. So it's up to you if you want to spend the time to farm those arrows, but they're definitely top tier. If you do not want to spend the time to farm those Stormhawk feathers, which I totally understand, the A tier arrows are just the standard arrows that you can buy at the merchant. It's the first type of arrows that you encounter in the game, and you can buy a full stock of them for very cheap. So they do not do as much posture break as the Stormhawk arrows. It's very unlikely you're gonna get a posture break if you use those arrows, but the damage is very close to the Stormhawk arrows. So oftentimes, out of any arrows, those are the second highest damage purely from the arrows. It beats any elemental arrows most of the time. So those are very good for damage, and you can buy as many as you want for cheap. In B tier, we're gonna have the thunder ammos. So the reason I'm separating the thunder arrows with the other elemental arrows is for some odd reason. Thunder in this game has a higher attack value than other elements. And you can actually see that because if you check your thunder arrows, they have a higher weapon rating than the other elements. I have no idea why, but it's just how it is in this game. So thunder arrows, even on monsters that are weaker to fire or any other type of damage, most likely thunder arrows are still going to be doing more damage than the other elements. And finally, in C tier, we have all the other elemental arrows. Elemental arrows in this game are kind of trash. They don't do much damage, and the physical arrows are gonna out damage the elemental arrows 99.9% of the time. There might be a couple of monsters where elemental arrows barely out damage physical arrows, but it's very few and far between. No, there are some arrows, of course, that I did not mention. The cold arrows I did not mention for a very specific reason is because we're gonna use a consumable that's going to replace them completely. But I'll talk about that in a little bit. Other arrows, like the poison arrows that I know a lot of people like, I think are completely useless because by the time you inflict the poison status, you can do a ton more damage with other type of arrows, like physical arrows or blood arrows. And the poison status by itself does very little damage, so I think they're completely useless. So the reason why I was saying the cold bone arrows are going to be replaced by a consumable is because I'm referring to the freezing pot. The freezing pot is an incredible consumable that I highly recommend you start using. It does 380 frost buildup, which is amazing. For comparison, a cold bone arrow does 60 buildup. And just as a reminder, when you freeze an enemy, they take 10% damage right away, and for the next 30 seconds, they take 20% additional damage. And since you only have 2 slots for arrows, using the freezing pot to inflict frostbite just frees up an arrow slot, so you can use a physical arrow and a bleed arrow and inflict frostbite with the freezing pot, which is a lot easier. Let's take a look at the talismans now. There are 3 talismans that I recommend to be always using with the bow, so those will not move no matter what. The first one, without any surprise, is the arrow sting talisman. This one increases your damage on every arrow by 10% no matter what you do. The second one that I highly recommend is the ritual sword talisman. This one also increases your damage by 10% when you're at full health. So it requires you to be at full health, but since you're playing ranged, you're a little bit safer than playing melee, so this is sustainable. At least for me, I find it to be sustainable. The third one that I always use is the Shard of Alexander. This talisman increases your skill damage by 15%. So every time you use barrage, which you're going to be using a lot, you're going to do 15% additional damage on your arrows. Now, the fourth slot for the talismans is my flex slot, so I do change this one quite a bit. Some of the talismans that I use frequently are the arrow reach talisman, which increase your range. This one I like quite a bit on bosses like Godfrey or Maliketh, because these bosses start far away from you in the arena, so this lets you get a lot of damage in while they get close to you. You can also use the turtle talisman that increases your stamina regeneration. If you plan on using elemental arrows, you can use the talisman that boosts your elemental damage. If you want to play without any armor, you can use the blue dancer talisman, which increases your damage at low equipment load. But basically this fourth slot is very flexible, so I'll let you choose what you want. Those are some suggestions, but you're going to have to adapt depending on what you're doing at the moment. So one thing that I suggest is to have at least 25 points in Faith. This will let you cast the Golden Vow incantation. This incantation buffs your damage by 15% for 90 seconds. So before a boss fight, you can cast it really quickly to benefit from a sizable buff in damage. You can also use the incantation Flame Grant Me Strength, which will give you a 20% physical damage boost, but this only lasts for 30 seconds. So usually if you want to use this, it's before a boss fight to have more damage in the first 30 seconds, but it's hard to keep up for the entirety of the fight. It's still a nice buff though. Now, a couple of tips when you're actually fighting a boss with the black bow. So first of all, how to use barrage. I would suggest to use barrage only when you can fire 3 or more arrows for bigger openings. If you can only fire 1 or 2 arrows, it's better to use the jumping and landing shots because they do more damage than the barrage shots. So only keep barrage for the larger openings. And my second tip is if you're gonna use bleed on a boss, only proc bleed once or twice if they are very weak to bleed. And the reason is every time you proc a status like bleed or frost, the boss gets significantly more resistant to it. So it takes a lot more arrow to proc the following status. So after you proc bleed once or twice, it's better to switch to the physical arrows like the Stormwing or the normal arrows that do more damage than the bleed arrows. So to summarize, what you want to do is buff before the fight with Golden Vow and other buffs if you have them. Then use the freezing pot to apply freeze to the bosses. Apply bleed once or twice and then switch to your physical arrows to finish the fight. If you have an opening for 3 arrows or more, you can use barrage, which is more efficient. If not, it's better to use your normal shots with jumping and rolling shots. But that's pretty much it. Bow is pretty simple. When you have the right build, it does amazing damage, as you can see on the clips throughout the video. I'm planning on making a new game progression guide for bow, which is not as good as the end game bow builds, of course. But if you're interested in that, leave a comment, and I'm gonna start working on it soon. All right, thank you all for watching. See you later.